Hey everyone, this is Vegan Theology episode number 3. This is Kevin.
Hi, this is Sarah. Welcome to everybody.
Yeah, hey.
We're excited to be back. We're excited for another episode. We did want to start today responding to some feedback, and we're excited that we're starting to get some feedback from you guys. We definitely want this to be, as much as possible, a dialogue, a conversation back and forth. So whether you have comments or concerns or questions or encouragement or, whatever it is, we love hearing from you. It makes our day. In fact, we got some really positive feedback from someone who goes by the handle of Believing Vegan.
Yeah, pretty awesome. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Very kind.
It really is a little wind in the sail to know that we're not just talking into a vacuum, and also I think Kevin and I were talking earlier this week. I think that you can feel so isolated as a vegan who is also a Christian, and your vegan friends don't necessarily want to talk about God, and your Christian friends don't necessarily want to talk about veganism, and it's almost like, I think we said in our intro, it almost starts to feel like it's burning inside your body. You want to be able to start talking about these things that are so important to you, that you value so much, and that means so much to you. So, but through doing this podcast and starting to get in contact with, starting to have people interested in what we're doing, all of a sudden you realize we are not alone, that there are other people who are in the same position with their theology and with their ethics. And so it really does, it's very encouraging. And it just makes you feel like, let's collaborate, let's encourage each other, let's get the word out, let's support each other any way we can. Let's really be a team. So, and one comment we got referred, I believe, to a book that we had cited in our book list.
Yeah, as part of the notes, as part of the podcast notes, I put some of the books in there that we that we reference. And one of them was Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. And of course, we don't agree with everything that Peter Singer says,
I think the person's comment was, that kind of takes away some credibility that you would even refer to someone like that, because they do have some views that we certainly do not agree with, either from a vegan standpoint, but also from a Christian standpoint. And so the person was kind of saying, like, when I saw Peter Singer in your book list, I was like, wait, I thought I was starting to maybe be interested and agree with some of what you're saying, but then I saw that and it kind of cooled my enthusiasm.
Right, and we were referencing a historical chapter in that book. And Peter Singer himself is actually really referencing an earlier 19th century work by a British guy. His name was Henry S. Salt, and his book was called Animal Rights Considered in Relation to Social Progress. And that book has some amazing historical references to it. So at any rate, we weren't referencing Peter Singer for any theological exegesis. And I think our view on this is that at the end of the day, all truth is God's truth. And there are other books we reference which didn't make it onto anyone's radar, but actually the book that I'm more concerned about, I think in our first episode we referenced Sandra Richter's Stewards of Eden, and in that book causes me a little more pause is that she there's value to the book, there really is, but she does make a case for humane killing, or at least she references it. And I just, of course, as vegans, we all know that there's really no such thing as humane killing. And so I look at that like, this is a place for this podcast, and this is a place for our views, and even this churches like the Creation Care Church. Our job is to even push back and educate theologians, people who have degrees, PhDs in Old Testament and biblical studies and these kinds of things. So that's why we're here. That's exactly why we're here. There's a gap. We know there's a gap, and we're here to do that. But I just want to say that I referenced Sandra Richter's book, and I don't agree with everything that Sandra Richter says. So, but again, it goes back to our view of God. Our view of God. And we could say that God is a maximally great being. And logically, there can only be one maximally great being. And so all truth is God's truth. And guess what? Humans, we distort God's truth many times, and our jobs is to try and find the truth, trying to line up with God's truth as best we can. And that's the task, really.
Yeah. So, yeah, I definitely appreciate the fact that, someone was maybe, triggered by seeing Peter Singer as someone we were referencing. Because I do sympathize with that. I can see why, certain authors, certain thinkers are offensive to our sensibilities in certain ways. So I think I would just say to keep in mind, as we workshop ideas and as we enter into conversation around different ideas from different people and different sources, if something appears in our book list, it certainly doesn't mean we agree with them at all, or we agree with them on some points and we differ with them on significant other points.
And we will point that out. And guess what? We might reference a book that we're actually critiquing.
Right.
And we recognize even Martha Nussbaum, she's a philosopher from University of Chicago. She's just come out this year with an amazing book. Let me just reference it real quick. It is called, it's called Justice for Animals, Our Collective Responsibility. And as a philosopher, she's come up with this capabilities approach for humans. And now she takes that approach that she's actually built and applies it to animals and our treatment of animals. So it's actually a great contribution. But Martha Nussbaum, I think she thinks it's okay to eat some form of crustacean or something. So, and I think she thinks that they're not sentient. So I forget specifically, we can get to that if we ever do get to that. But that's just another example of somebody that we think is making good contributions to the vegan cause, but we might not agree with them on everything. So.
But again, we definitely welcome any and all feedback, and we do take it seriously, and we think that it only makes us better to be challenged or to be encouraged or just to kind of get some feedback so that we're not just unreflecting, and keep us honest, keep us accountable to what we say, and because we do want to do this with the most integrity and the most humility we can. So yeah, vegantheology@gmail.com is one way you can reach out to us, and we will read those emails and definitely respond. So leading us into today's topic, we wanted to kind of review, because we are trying to build a case. Overall, we're trying to build a faithful theology. And so we're just trying to go very systematically through the text and through the concepts. And so our first episode was a kind of a comparative creation myth conversation where we compared the Hebrew creation account we find in Genesis to Enuma Elish, is that right?
Yeah, Mesopotamian,
which is kind of representative of some of the other creation myths that were contemporaries with the Hebrew creation myth.
Right.
And the point of that was that unlike what we would consider the pagan creation myths, our story really represents a God who is loving and peaceful and caring and provides for creation in a very benevolent, kind way.
Right. And as we'll get into today, he's also a king. And so he's sitting on his throne in heaven, and he's almost decreeing that the creation happen. And we'll get more into that today, getting into the royal language of the image more we're headed, but go ahead.
And so, unlike the other myths, which were very, very violent, very, very gory and bloody, and with a lot of jealousy and war and revenge, and ours is a stark difference.
Right. Yeah, there's peace. There's no predation. There's no violence.
There's abundance.
There's abundance.
Rest.
There's no competition, like a capitalist competition.
Yeah.
So
there's value in just existing.
Right.
Instead of what can be produced through you.
Right. And there's not a lot of striving, like
scarcity. And,
right.
Yeah, it's very, very different. So it's fun to really just kind of marinate in those differences, because it reveals so much about God. So then the second episode, we went into the language used to describe the creatures that God created. So starting with bird life and water life, those creatures in chapter 1, verse 20, and then the land animals on day 6 in chapter 1, verse 24, and then the creation of the human in chapter 2, verse 7. And we highlighted the fact that this exact same phrase is used to describe those creatures, animal and human, which is nefesh chaya, living creatures. Yeah. And we read the definitions of those two terms, the nefesh and the chaya, from the Bible dictionary.
Yeah, from NIDOTTE.
And pointed out that basically, according to this text, human animal and non-human animal are the exact same composition.
Right.
And so when translations take the liberty to translate that phrase 2 different ways, to call animals one thing and to call humans something different, how do they support that? How do they defend that choice? It's clearly not from the Hebrew text.
Right. It's not from the biblical text. It's from extra-biblical sources.
Or bias.
Bias, but philosophical and or other theological sources, right?
Right. So yeah, if you read a translation that uses different language for the creation of the animal kingdom and then like the human, and we know that humans belong to the animal kingdom, but that just remember that they're taking liberties there, and it's not supported by the Hebrew language.
Right. And so one of the things we did say was that we were quoting some commentator, and he basically said, actually I think it was NIDOTTE, it was the Bible dictionary we were referencing, that said the only difference between humans and animals was that humans were made in the image of God. And so today that leads us to the image of God. So we're going to be talking about that. So we're just trying to build this case. And the image of God, known by many theologians in Latin terms as the Imago Dei. And so, there's a long history throughout church history of what the Imago Dei means. And I would even say for myself, there was a time when I thought, I was stamped with some internal, substance that made me in the image of God, and I was special and unique and different in that sense. And, even if I didn't know exactly what that property was, I just thought I was unique. But it turns out that theology itself, by the way, we're referencing a book by J. Richard Middleton. It's called The Liberating Image, the Imago Dei in Genesis 1. And in there he gives a historical account of how, this is one case where systematic theologians have possibly misinterpreted the image of God or the Imago Dei for centuries. And in one quote he says, "For centuries, theologians have used extra-biblical sources and philosophical ideas to explain what the image of God means. Few have attempted to root their interpretation in the context of Genesis itself." Wow. Another quote, he quotes a specialist, David Carnes, comments that all the Christian writers up to Aquinas interpreted the image of God as man's power of reason. Okay, and his comment on that is, which betrays Platonic influence on theology. And so this is what we're finding. We're finding a lot of the theologians up until really the 20th century, and it really wasn't theologians, it was biblical scholars who really pulled out the view that we're going to represent today. But I think the essence of the theologians, the systematic theologians, was that they were arguing from outside of the text, really, that the image of God was some sort of ethical ability, some rational ability, some intellect, some relational sense ability of us to God, some divine sense. And so I think the view we're going to present today is more of what biblical scholars are calling the royal functional view. But
what jumped out at me when you were saying that, Kevin, is the fact that theologians, for like the mainstream theologians for a significant period of church history, were defining image of God from extra biblical sources.
Yeah, ideas, yeah.
And I think that's such a sobering fact that we all need to just admit right, is that whatever culture waters we're swimming in, we bring that to the text.
Right.
And at least we should admit it and try to be as aware of it as possible.
Right.
But how sad is it that the prevailing understanding of the average Christian or the average pastor or whatever of this concept of image of God has been influenced, colored by Greek Gnostic kind of thinking,
Right.
Which has nothing to do with the ancient Near Eastern text that we were given.
And what the original hearers of this word would have thought about it. And that's kind of what we're going to try to get to today. But this also is just another commentary on how, as a church, we're supposed to interpret the word in community. But this is an example where the community for centuries of church history has been maybe non-biblical in their interpretation of the image of God, the Imago Dei. So
what excites me about what we're going to present today is I think it is so much more it authentically in line with, okay, how would the ancient Near Eastern person understand this language?
Right.
Like, what would their automatic, I know exactly what you're talking about, understanding be?
Right.
Like in their culture, in their time, this phrase had a very specific meaning.
Yes.
that we tend to overlook at best.
Overlook or don't even know.
Overlook
would indicate that, we were aware of it and we just, gloss over it. No, I mean, we're unaware of it.
I to be fair, I think in some of the sermons I've heard that reference the image of God, there's some elements of what we're going to say today that, is in the awareness pool. But I think we're gonna put a finer point on it today, or drive it home a little bit more fully today.
Right.
So let's orient the conversation around the Hebrew text. If we could go to Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 26. And I guess the two terms that we're going to be really focusing in on today are image and likeness. So starting with verse 26, then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them.
And so the Hebrew words, so you have those, but the Hebrew word for image is Salem?
Yes, Salem, which if you want to look that up, the NIVEC number is 7512. The Strong's number is 6754. So image, the Hebrew word is Salem, and likeness is demuth in Hebrew. NIVEC number 1952 and Strong's number 1823.
Right. So if you want to follow along, those are the numbers in the Concordance that would match up with a theological dictionary, and we're using NIDOTTE, the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, edited by Willam VanGemeren. Okay, and so we're going to be referencing two books. Like I said, we're referencing The Liberating Image by J. Richard Middleton. The subtitle is The Imago Dei in Genesis 1, and Sarah's referencing NIDOTTE. Okay, so just a quote from Middleton. He says, "Studies of Israel and the ancient Near East that cite Mesopotamia and Egyptian stories in which kings and sometimes priests were designated the image or likeness of a particular god, whether Enlil, Shamash, Marduk, Amun-Re, or Horus, a designation that served to describe their function, analogous to that of a cult image, of representing the deity in question, and of mediating divine blessing to the earthly realm."
So what I'm hearing you say is, or what I'm hearing Middleton say is, the ancient Near Eastern person understood that God would bestow God's image on the king or maybe a priest.
Someone to dole out God's blessings.
And that person then was God's embodied representation
on earth.
Spoke for God's will.
Right. Not their own will.
Represented God's character.
Yes, God's character, key.
So again, going back to our familiar Genesis passage, God is saying, let's make all humans in our likeness, in our image,
right,
to rule over creation and to basically to represent God on the planet,
right,
to be God's representative.
And again, that is very unique within the ancient Near East, that every human would be given the image of God. Usually it was reserved for priests and kings.
Just like one individual in the culture.
Right.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
Yeah, and that gets into, okay, and it's also worth noting, and we just need to put this in perspective since we're talking about the ancient Near Eastern culture, that doing a word study, which is what we're doing right now, referencing a theological dictionary. It's a tool, and sometimes, as we know, tools are as good as the person wielding them. So it's always humbling to represent God's word. So here we go. So we're talking, gets technical, but basically we're saying, Middleton is saying that the semantic range of Salem, the Hebrew word for image in Genesis 1, includes idols. Although its semantic range is broader than this single meaning, we need to account for Salem in many contexts, clearly referring to a cult image, which in the common theology of the ancient Near East is precisely a localized, visible, and corporeal representation of the divine. Okay? So what they're getting at is that the ancient Near Eastern person, the observer, would have been looking for a visible and bodily representation of God. And I love that definition in the sense that we are God's image bearers. We are God's royal representatives on earth to do his will, not our will. But I love that it says localized, visible, and bodily. Mm-hmm. Localized, visible. So think about that. When God tells us to increase and multiply and spread over the earth, he's asking us to be his representative across the earth, a bodily, localized, visible representative. And the only way to do that is to multiply.
And yeah, I think going back to what you were saying earlier, the Greek influence, the Gnostic influence, that only the spiritual matters, only the mind matters, and that the body is worthless or corrupted or whatever, I think has robbed Christianity in so many different ways, that we don't see the body as sacred. We don't see the body as important to our mission.
And that just reminds me, Middleton makes the point that in all the theological observations and interpretations, they 100% almost unanimously don't include the body in their definition of what the image of God means.
Yeah, it's a very Greek idea that we can separate out the elements of what makes a whole human.
Right.
Whereas in Hebrew and ancient Near Eastern thinking, it was just the whole person.
Right.
Everything about that person, the invisible and the visible, was all one. Whereas in Greek thinking, it's very distinct, and there's value to, like I said, the mind, the spirit.
Right. In philosophical terms, a lot of times we refer to that as dualism. In philosophical metaphysics, we talk about what the substance of things is sometimes, and in African theology is what we might call a monism. It's everything's one substance, from spirit to body to soul. It's all one thing, and we're seeing that in the ancient Near Eastern mind and in the Hebrew mind. There's no dualism, and I even think today in Trinitarian theology, there's a push to get Christian theology back to a sensibility of monism as well, and get away from dualistic thinking. Anyway.
Yeah. So I'd love to share the entry from the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, Volume 1, nice. on the entry under Salem. The thing is, when you look up Salem in this dictionary, it says see Demuth.
Right, go to likeness.
So, yeah, and it makes a case right here in this entry that I'll read that basically image and likeness in this context are synonymous. They are interchangeable terms. Yeah. So the nature of the likeness of humans to God, as far as the Genesis narrative is concerned, can be established with relative clarity. The function of dominion is indicated in the passage. So it is reasonable to make function the primary point of the analogy. So right away, I love that. We're just looking at, okay, what does the text address? Mm-hmm. And let's just take the text on on its own terms.
Right.
And I like so when he's talking about the analogy, he's talking about the royal analogy, again, that we've kind of been referring to, that
right.
That the king gives the king's likeness to, or like God gives image to the king, and then the king has subjects that do the king's will too. So,
and implied in that image is a function, a job function, so to speak. And this view, as we're calling it, and Middleton's calling it, the royal functional view.
Okay. So this is further confirmed by the bilingual inscription. So now he's going to talk about an actual ancient statue, and the inscription that is on the statue. So he's saying this is further confirmed by the bilingual inscription of Tel Fakhariah. So that's the name of the statue. The statue itself is a representation of the rule of King Hadad Yati of ancient Guzan over the territory of Sikan across the river. So again, they erected a statue to say, your ruler is this king, right?
Right. Or you're in his territory.
Yeah. So the Aramaic refers to the statue as Demuth as well as Salem. So again, image and likeness. The terms are interchangeable, suggesting that no particular distinction is to be found between them in their combination in Genesis. Further, their application to the physical form of the statue indicates that the physical human form is a critical aspect of the function of image. It would seem that Genesis makes a transfer of the concept of representation by a statue to that of a living being. So kind of like what you were reading, that this term can often have to do with idols or icons. But in the Genesis, it has to do with a living person.
It has to do with a living human.
The likeness does not consist of the physical form at all. Rather, the likeness is in the function of that form to represent the presence of God in the world. This is affirmed by Psalms 8, which talks in royal terms about humans' role as subjects of the king, which has as its central theme the majesty of God in the world. The divine presence is represented through the creation of humans who exercise dominion. If the likeness to God is function, as suggested by both lexical and theological data, the sense of verse 26 is to say we are created as God's image, taking our physical presence represents the divine presence.
That's crazy.
So this is what we would propose. This is what Genesis is actually saying to the ancient Near Eastern person, is that, oh my goodness, our God has made every one of us God's image bearer, God's likeness on this planet.
Has made each one of us royalty, has made each one of us a representative of him, has made each one of us a viceroy. And the term viceroy means in place of, meaning you are God's representative in place of him. It's a great word, viceroy. And so think about that. So what we've built so far in our case is that God created a very peaceful, nonviolent, abundant, non-predatory environment in Eden. He made humans and animals the same, and then he made humans the viceroys, the representatives of this, to rule that planet, that Eden that we're supposed to spread throughout the entire planet, rule it like he would do it.
Yeah. It's almost like God passes the baton to the humans, right? Like God says, okay, I've shown you who I am. I've shown you through this beautiful, functioning, or well-ordered and harmonious creation, I have shown you my character.
Yep.
Now I'm passing the baton to you, and now you get to represent me and continue the rule
the way I would rule. And we're going to get into in future podcasts the concept of order and disorder, or what some would call chaos and cosmos. Theologians refer to it that way. And we're going to get to the fact that God established a orderly environment. And the idea, too, that we've kind of been saying is this royal concept that comes with a job function. And we're going to get into that, too. John Walton, in his Genesis commentary, talks about form and function in terms of how the world was created. And I think what Sarah was mentioning, I think it's worth noting if you're maybe a little skeptical of this royal view. You can think of in Genesis 1:20, I believe it is, 1:26. In Genesis 1:26, when God says, "Let us make man," he's referring to his royal court. He's sitting on his throne. And then if you look at Isaiah 6:1, Isaiah's having this vision and he sees God sitting on his throne. And in 6:8, God says, "Whom shall we send? And who shall go for us?" And again, God is addressing his royal court. Mm-hmm. And then Psalm 8, we should read Psalm 8, because that again bolsters this royal view of humans as God's viceroys.
So I think it's worth pointing out that the writers of Scripture, so we're talking about the writer of Genesis, the writer of Psalm 8, or the writer of Isaiah, like they're depicting God as a king holding court on the throne, because that's what the culture, that's what the ancient Near East understood. They completely got that image.
Well, even if you know the story of the Hebrews, right? They kept pining for a king, right?
Yeah.
They kept saying, "Give us a king, give us a king, give us a king." And God said, "Okay, fine." Reluctantly, God gave him a king. Mm-hmm. So it's part of that ancient Eastern worldview. And if we're to read Psalm 8 right now, I'm just going to skim a little bit, but it begins, O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. And then it goes on and says, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? You have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. And that just reminds me, in the Genesis passage there, Genesis 1:26-27, when God creates man, he says, let us make man in our image and our likeness, so that he may rule and subdue. And all of the biblical scholars are saying that combination of those two words, rule and subdue, which we're going to get into next podcast, those words closely associated with image and likeness 100% refer to, like, I think Middleton even essentially just said that there's no question that this refers to royal function. And I think that's fascinating.
And so, like these words, and like you said, we're going to get into these words next time, like the subdued, dominion, rule over.
Right.
Like, we read those and it's like, man, it really sounds like we can do whatever we want, right, with abandon, with impunity.
Right.
But again, how does it make logical sense that if we're God's representative, that we should rule with impunity, that we should rule with cruelty, that we should exploit and abuse and commodify God's creation? It's so much more consistent to think, if we're God's representatives, we should reflect God's character and how we treat the rest of creation.
Right. And I just want to point out, too, in Middleton's book, he mentions the royal functional interpretation of the image came to have a particular significant role among Renaissance humanists in 15th century Italy, although often left out of historical accounts of imago interpretation because they were not members of the theological or clerical guild. Thinkers such as Ficini, Morandi, and Pico della Mirandola developed an interpretation of the Imago Dei as godlike power that humans exercised on earth.
So like when would that have been? When were they saying that?
15th century, so
Okay.
16 something.
So the thinking was out there. This kind of thinking was out there, but it was kind of overlooked or passed over.
They didn't take them seriously because they weren't theologians
or they weren't the clerics. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting. So if you're hearing what we're getting at, I think the way we're reading the text is we're trying to stay true to the biblical text. Again, we're referencing word studies, we're referencing theological dictionaries, and we're really trying to do the text justice. And I think if you haven't picked up on it already, I think one of the things we are presenting is a sort of pre-fall view of God's intentions.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to also present a post-fall view. Okay, so we're trying to set up this case. And if you follow me and if you know what that means, we're trying to...
Almost like a post-redemption view.
Yeah, we're trying to set up God's original intentions, what he originally intended for creation, and where we're going to end up, the goal of creation. So, if that makes any sense. It's exciting to me.
A preview of what's to come.
Yeah, preview of what's to come. So, anyway, very exciting stuff.
Yeah. And what all this study has really reminded me of, too, is some work done by a theologian, Carmen Imes, recently in her book about Exodus. So she covers the 10 Commandments, and I was so taken by her interpretation of the third commandment, which is from Exodus 20, verse 7. So the third commandment, as you remember, states, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him blameless or guiltless who takes his name in vain." So she has brought from the text through all of her studies of the culture that our understanding of this commandment is so anemic and so incomplete, because we basically have turned it into be careful how you use God's name, right? Like, don't use it as a swear word, and don't misuse or disrespect God's name.
Right.
And she's saying this has really nothing to do with that, if honestly. And she's saying that basically the commandment would be more faithfully interpreted or translated, "Do not misrepresent me on earth." So this is very consistent with what we've been saying about image and likeness. Your whole job that I gave you at creation is to be my representatives, to be my image on the planet, to rule the way I would rule. And so when you go out there and you're misrepresenting me, I hate that. Don't do it.
Right.
So like the goal is every day we get up, and with our relationships and our work and, how we show up on this planet, to commit to how can I faithfully represent God, instead of, representing my own will, how can I represent God's will on the planet?
No, that's great, Sarah. Love that.
Yeah, I mean, and so when you think about, the overfished oceans, or you think about how we've genetically modified animals to get the most meat as quickly as we possibly can, even though it puts their organs and their bones under extreme suffering situations. When you think about how they're, egg-laying hens are prisoners in their own bodies, we've modified them so much that they ovulate every day.
Right.
Or when you think about how we have to kill calves so that we can steal the milk intended for the calves, so that we can sell and commodify the milk that comes out of cows. I mean, how are we doing? How are we doing with this command? How are we doing at representing God's character to creation when, we've turned animals into machines, instead of thinking empathetically and what is actually best for this animal to have the least amount of suffering and have a long, happy life. We slaughter them at 6 months old or 12 months old, and and mass produce them, and we could go on and on and on. But it's just holding this theology up to how current events and how we use animals for entertainment and for fashion and for scientific experiments, vivisection.
Yeah.
Like, I would I would definitely make the argument that we are failing on a massive, unthinkable scale. We've used the image of God and we've basically said, oh, I have the power, I have the permission to do whatever I want.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to be too strong, but in some ways, it is kind of heretical. We are doing the opposite. Humans on this planet are doing the opposite of our functional charge to be God's viceroys on this planet, his image bearers. And it's even to use the word ungodly, it is ungodly what we're doing to animals. It's horrific. So, all right, well, we can end on a happy note.
So yeah, I think just to give us some hope, because we believe that truth will win out. That's the nature of truth. That's the nature of
God's truth,
goodness and beauty, is that we can catch this image we can be inspired. We can be excited about the job that God has given us. And we can get excited about what our function is as the image bearers of God. And yeah, if God gave us this job, I believe God will help us to complete it.
Right. And I feel like that's what this podcast is about. And the other entities that we're becoming aware of, like the Creation Care Church that we've bumped into. I mean, I love the fact that there's a church out there called the Creation Care Church. And we need to have more of those kinds of churches.
Yeah.
And we need to start getting this thinking into the minds of Christians so that we can become proper
and faithful,
functioning, faithful image bearers.
Have a great day, everybody.
Peace. See you next time.